Hello and welcome. This is the Focus Masterclass podcast, where we speak to some of the great minds in visual effects to dive deep into every part of the industry, from production, the creative process, business, and technology. In this edition, we're back with MPC Production Side VFX Supervisor Charley Henley. This time, he tells us all about shooting creatures, including working with creature and makeup departments, plus traditional creature effects. Please enjoy Charley Henley's masterclass.
Hello, so this is Charley Henley, a visual effects supervisor with MPC, currently working on production side. Just finished Artemis Fowl. A little summary of some of the things that practical creatures or special effects makeup might do on a film. You've got prosthetic makeup, gore effects, animatronics, puppeteered practical creatures, dummies, men in monster suits, and a kind of crossover hybrid approach to creatures, which may be part practical creature effects and part CG. You've got the prosthetic makeup stuff. We used it on in Cinderella on the goose man who was the coachman on Cinderella's carriage, and is basically started off as a goose, and then ends up back at a goose, but in the middle he's a coachman that's part-ish goose. So they did a goose face on him, which was a beak, like a mask, and then a lot of makeup, extra crazy hair, feathery hands, and prosthetic goose feet that would attach to his legs. And that allowed us to shoot a half goose man driving the coach. So it was a real proper coach driver. Actor, stunt actor, I guess, driving the coach dressed up like that. It takes hours of makeup in the morning, some of these things, so generally production is not that keen if they can get away with doing stuff in visual effects. But for us, it gave a great basis. It worked in wider shots, it looked good enough. He could perform for wild shots. You'd see him half a goose man. When you got close, sometimes it felt a bit too makeup-y. We needed to change the eyes a bit, things like that. So we took over and did a bit of CG. That was kind of how that played out. Obviously, there's lots of other prosthetic makeup. Could be anything from just scars to wounds. So you've got gore effects as well. They may do blood squibs, practical wounds. Sometimes that takes a bit of enhancing, especially if you've got like a deep wound that should be go within inside the body. Obviously, the makeup can't go into a body, they can only add on top. So quite often that is a limitation. Animatronics is pretty cool. Remote controlled, radio controlled mechanisms inside a prosthetic face, or it could be animatronic animals. We have like animatronic horse for Cinderella that was effectively without the legs. It's like a horse on wheels, but it's got a head, and the head would mechanically move, and the ears would mechanically move, and the whole thing would rock correctly to the dynamics of a horse. So an actor could sit on that, be towed along, but for medium close-up shots, it felt like they were on a real horse. So that's an animatronic horse, totally practical. Sometimes CG one, we added CG tails and stuff, or on a wide shot, we just replaced the whole horse, but you got the physical motion from the animatronic. So that's kind of cool. You got puppeteered practical creatures as well. So that would be something like the Deacon in Prometheus, the face huggers in the original Alien. We did similar practical puppeteered face huggers in Alien Covenant as well. The Hammerpede was puppeteered, which is another snake-like creature in Prometheus. And then, generally the VFX work is to clean out the puppeteers, tidy up the joins, rig removal, a little bit of enhancement sometimes. Puppeteers are quite often brought into action. You've got creature effects, which are often very talented at creating realistic human heads and dummies. So an example of that would be in Alien with quite a lot of dead bodies. So the creature effects team for Alien Covenant created, cast heads from actors and duplicated, created silicon versions of them. Really beautiful techniques of building the skin, subsurface skin, using types of silicon and makeup, and building layered blood layers underneath the slightly translucent skin to give it depth. Beautiful eyes now. You can kind of glass eyes that make them look really incredibly realistic. So we had, which saves a lot of CG if we had to go that way, but also practical to do on set. And some of those techniques are useful just to create fantasy creatures as well, because you can get quite realistic skin texture. For example, the hammerpede in Prometheus was built with layers, so it had it was semi-transparent, which always kind of can help sell something as being tangible or yucky, depending which way you want to go, or both. They built a spine inside that was like mechanically operated, so it could bend. On top of that, they had a layer of kind of blood vessels. On top of that, they had a layer of silicon that was the skin surface. On top of that, they're putting on KY jelly and whatever to make it look slick, and then a bit of grit. We had to do a CG version of that. So our CG version was built exactly the same way, basically, which made total sense because we were copying it. So we built it up in all the layers, and each layer was developed to match what that material looked like. And then we created like a super accurate match for CG takeovers when it has to go inside one of the guys' helmets and squirm around and go down his throat. And similarly with other creatures. So that sort of translucent technique can work quite nicely. Also, the baby xenomorph was built from the inside out in CG. They did build a practical version of that, but we replaced that completely CG. So it had to do so many different things, and it was so delicate and small that it was actually hard to build something practical with that much detail, that tiny. And that was built like skeleton, muscles, fat, sinew, skin surface, and it was translucent, but the idea was it should be translucent, so it was shot from behind with a torch and kind of enjoyed that translucency. Puppeteered practical creatures, so I mean they can do a lot with puppeteering, but sometimes you end up having to replace quite a lot as well. The dummies also quite useful in moments where an actor has something to happen to them very abruptly, for example, in Alien, we had one of the face huggers plants an egg in somebody, and then the baby alien worm thing explodes out of their mouth, and it's all quite gruesome and unpleasant, a bit like Chestbuster. That's basically what it is, but it's like a mouth buster. So they built a head for the actor, a full dummy and a very realistic head, and then from inside they could push through the on a line the chestbuster, along with gallons of blood, fake blood spurting out, which is another thing that the creature department do quite a lot. But we shot the whole scene with the actor screaming and acting out the whole part, and then we pick up the next section with the dummy being puppeteered and shot that, and then in the end they matched so nicely. It was just a case of cleaning out the wires and using cuts to cut from the real actor to a close-up of the puppeteered actor just as the action happens. You got men in suits, which would be like a full outfit, would be great for Halloween parties, but they're quite hard to put on sometimes. You've got the original Alien. It's probably was a pretty good man in a suit, but has its limitations, of course. With potentially, sometimes you get a guy wearing the suit and an animatronic head is attached to that. The engineers in Prometheus were Originally, they were meant to be very tall, but then that meant CG, and that was budget, and at the time, very difficult to achieve super realistic. They did do CG. Weta did a CG version of the Engineers, but to do it's challenging to make it look properly photoreal. So they did. They found some, I think, very tall sports basketball players, and built the suits around them, and so they were full suits. Worked pretty well. You've got crossover approaches again, where you've got a man in a suit, but perhaps you're altering some of that in CG, mainly because of the limitations, really. So I always thought a great example was Mr. X's merman in Shape of Water, where he's clearly in a, the movie character is a bit like, it looks like it's an underwater merman creature. It sort of feels like he's a man. It's practical in a sense. It's practical, and maybe it looks a little bit like a man in a suit, but it really suits the movie and the mood, and it's so down to earth and real, and you have none of this sort of, there's, for a budget like that, there's no risk of it just feeling like it's giving itself away as computer generated. But the face in that film is pretty much all replaced with CG, and that just plays into the limitations really of the practical and the character performance that you can get out of a face with either animatronics or puppeteering or a mask that limits someone's face. So that crossover approach is a key of getting the best of both worlds in a lot of cases. The main things would be trying to do things to all practically will be the motion, because obviously if it's a puppeteer, they're limited in motion and movement, even if you're going to clean them out. If it's a man in a suit, but it's meant to be a creature that's super fast or, super athletic, they're going to be limited in motion. And that's one of those key issues there. And then you've got different body shapes. I mean, another simple thing would be just that the thing about them. There's the body shape, which is more like if you're human, you're limited. Obviously, you've got the shape of a human. You can add to it, like with the xenomorph, we did build a practical version because Ridley wanted a practical alien for some of the scenes on set, but we knew that it would never do all the things that he wanted it to do in terms of speed of motion and dexterity of motion and how much it was demanded that it would be visible on screen. But there was and the design of it ended up being like tall but also incredibly skinny. So they did build a version with a puppeteer, like part shoulders was, the man was in the shoulders. He had like risers on his feet to get height, and then the front of him was sort of puppeteered, like attached to the rest of the legs were stuck to his legs, and the theory was he could move a bit and then we could paint out the puppeteer behind and he could walk around. But of course it was very clunky, and really, we got some great super close-up head stuff with the animatronic head. We got great close-ups of some interactions, but in the end we had to replace pretty much most of it for that film. Another limitation is, of course, the makeup cannot go into a body. So, for example, Voldemort's nose on one of Harry Potter's, I can't remember which one we first see Voldemort, but we had to do a digital nose replacement. So they did full makeup for all of him, but because they wanted to take away his nose, they couldn't take away his nose without chopping it off, so we had to chop it off digitally and put a nose replacement in. So that's kind of hybrid. Then there's just a lot of complexity really on set with all the puppeteers. So generally a production can move quite slickly if it's all CG, but if you've got a lot of masses of makeup, it can take a lot longer in the morning to get everybody ready, sometimes hours. That really affects the shoot day because the actors they're on time from the moment they start doing makeup. So, and then you've got puppeteers on set, which is complex. You got and there's the reliability of it, which is always on edge. And then a lot of it gets moved to set. So there's a lot of tricky bits about trying to do things too practically, which is why we come in. Just briefly, I'll go over what we do on set in terms of what we can bring to set to help create these creatures. You've got reference stuffies, which are anything that represents the real texture, or perhaps quite realistically represents the creature, so that's like works as a lighting reference. Obviously, we had little stuffed taxidermy mice on sticks that we could run through set for the mice in Cinderella, or actors could hold, which was great lighting reference. We had real mice for animation reference, but we didn't bring them on set at the time. Sometimes you've got stuntmen for interaction with actors. That's where men in suits comes in sometimes. So they can be great for interaction, for lighting reference, but for performance. Ridley really wanted to have, in the end, men in suits rather than reference heads, so that he could perform, have something to cut with, have the actors have something to react to. Sometimes you got the motion capture stand-in, so that would just be bringing a real person in that plays the part, but they're all in a tracking suit rather than not a grey tracksuit with markers on. Maybe they got a face cam on, so you're recording their facial performance in order to drive animation or reference for animation in post, but they're going to be completely replaced. You might have puppeteers as well. So puppets on set as references.
Thanks again, Charlie. So we'll go into our Q&A now. My first question is, how do you decide which aspects of a creature to use prosthetics on, to use makeup on? Is it more based on efficiency or budget or time limitations?
I mean, with what I've done, it depends a bit on the design. So if you're really keen to push the proportions beyond what a human can do, then you may end up having to replace more in order to push those proportions. So I think the priorities are either in the aspect of character going beyond what you can achieve, but mostly it's about hitting the limitations of the practical, and the limitations are often facial expression or facial proportions. So like a practical face, they can only build out, obviously, and you can only build the eyes. If you're going to use the human eyes, they can only be where they are on the face. But the creature, you might want the eyes to be wider or higher, and or the back of the head, or the mouth to be twice as big or something. So once you start going out of proportion, then you're like, well, we're going to have to replace that. But perhaps you can keep, the legs, the costumes. You can make the legs look shorter, but it's hard to make them look longer. You can put them on risers, and they do look a bit longer, but it depends. So I'd say it's the two things: proportion and performance. Basically, it's just whatever part you can't get out of the practical version.
So it is a matter of kind of pushing the limits of the practical effects, and then whatever can't be done, that's what you do in post.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's trying. I think the sensible thing would be, obviously to work these things out early, to do tests, but to not get too stuck up on trying to make things work that don't. Because once you're in the CG world, you can do a lot. But if there's something consistently that you won't have to change, and you can get that practically, then that makes a lot of sense, So
yeah.
And for me, it just it forced the CG into the real world. So those scenes look really seamless for me, rather than sometimes, especially when you work on it a lot, you just have this sort of uncanny feeling that maybe it's computer generated. It's getting so good sometimes you don't, but I don't know, if it depends. So when you've got something there for real, it's really handy. And costumes in particular are a pain. And on set, it's just that interactivity that's so good, so it's so natural.
Yeah. Is there a typical are there typical mistakes that you face in post after you've shot all these scenes with the practical effects? Like, is there like a common mistake that you still need to fix even after you've gone the whole mile for the practical effects?
Well, you do, and you often do, even if it was, like the seams. There's like if it's puppeteered, obviously there's parts of the puppets that's disconnected, or there's bits that just move wrong or fall apart, or like fixing up stuff. Sometimes, often in enhancing even like the skin quality, because obviously there's a lot of work to get the skin quality right. But when it's got layers of makeup on, if you're close up, then it may not look, it can look a bit rubber, perhaps. So you can sort of work on top to make some of that skin quality look less rubbery,
Yeah.
or less like prosthetic makeup. So sometimes you end up just trying to tart up the makeup. It's almost like digital makeup, or like eyes. If they're fake eyes, you can try and bring them to life, maybe more movement. So there's another layer in there where you're just enhancing. But I mean, it's not really necessarily a mistake. I wouldn't say it's ever a mistake, but there's a lot when you're trying to bring a lot of practical to the set. There's an element of, if I was financing it, you'd be looking at the amount of money going into a prosthetic or a practical or an animatronic or a practical creature on set that's then going to get replaced in CG. It's like, why wouldn't you put the money more just into the CG if you're going to do it anyway? If you're going to do it anyway, I mean, there's a lot of argument of trying to, when it comes to the budget, of trying to, what's the most practical way of getting the best out of both. And that you could work to help that. So, for example, with this hybrid approach, you may say we're always going to change the faces, so you don't need to spend. You can have a mask style face, or you can even have just a human face, but you've got prosthetic suit body. You don't have to spend so long on set,
Yeah, that makes sense.
Or in makeup, for example, because it's quite a big expense to have people in like, if you've got like 50 goblins, they will have to go in makeup for ages. But if they only have to be work for the background, then and you replace them close up, then they can build masks and just pull on the mask and do a lot less makeup, for example. But when you've got like, you want a man in a suit, and then you're going to replace him, and you want the man in the suit to look great, or then you can be doubling up. It's a bit of a luxury to be able to bring both of those things to play. It just depends on the film, though, doesn't it, really?
What would be your role on set? Would you be the point person for these practical effects, and do you kind of work directly with the people who create the prosthetics, the makeup, the animatronics, or like what's that relationship like?
As a production supervisor, you're sort of with all those teams from the beginning, or at least I have been. So it's like, from the script, you're deciding, you're in early, and you're debating with creature effects who does what, how you work it out together, what you can bring onto set, who designs what's the overlap of design. It could be a pretty close relationship. If you come in like really late on a project, a lot of that might have been decided already, or just they may have been saying, yeah, we're just going for this practical, and then you come in and you're going to have to fix it all in post or something. But if you're lucky enough to get on a project early, then you're in there in the process of kind of haggling where the budget goes, who does what when, and trying to work out the best scenario for everybody, and work as a team, really. I mean, it's like there's lots of departments, creatures, makeup. All the interesting thing about VFX really is it crosses over with like all the departments. So when you're there as a supervisor, you have to have a kind of working relationship with production designer, building sets, the creature guys, if they're going to do some practical creatures, figuring out how to bring it on set. And then when you're on set, your responsibility is to see that it's shot in the best way without encompassing the director and how he wants to film, it depends on that too. So there's a way, whether they want close interaction with something that they get their hands on, or whether they'd like to just make it simple on the day, focus on the actors, and any creature stuff, deal with it later. Ridley would love to get in there, so he would, we'd bring puppets on set, and he'd come in and start dressing it himself and posing them and getting his hands dirty and trying to resolve issues. And he liked the game of doing things practically, so he was, so he brought more practical in than you might have done if you were just being very conservative about upfront creature work.
Thanks so much, Charley, for that wonderful masterclass and for being patient with the questions and answering them all really with great insight.
Thank you for the questions, and thanks for the opportunity.
If you enjoyed this masterclass podcast, please sign up to our newsletter at thefocus.com/subscribe to keep up with future podcasts, as well as get the latest visual effects content, tailored job alerts, and virtual learning materials straight to your inbox. You can also subscribe, follow, or like us on our social media channels at The Focus Careers. We'll share the links to those channels in the description. We'll speak again next time.